Hey everybody, this is Ryan Weaver, the founder of Fuel to Ignite, the ministry designed to provide biblical encouragement through the struggles of life. With this weekend being Father's Day, we're going to be focusing on fathers, and we're going to have an interesting message today, and I promise if you stick with me, it's all going to make sense. The title of this message is this: Of Earthly Fathers, Spiritual Fathers, and Rising Above Family Origins. Again, of earthly fathers, spiritual fathers, and rising above family origins. You know, Father's Day can be a difficult time of the year for many of us. And one of the reasons is many of us have already lost our father along the way. I know my father passed away 20 plus years ago. And it's hard to imagine it's been that long, but, you know, many of us just long to have one more conversation with our dads. And there are those of us also who have difficult relationships with our father. Maybe they're still alive, but you just don't have a good relationship. It's a strained relationship, and maybe you're estranged from each other. And I know that in my life, my dad and I had a complicated relationship at times, and the Lord did a great work in that, and I'm going to be sharing some of that today. But it wasn't easy, and it was only by the grace of God that things ended well for us, and I'm so grateful that it did. Today we're going to be looking at an interesting passage, and this is where we're going to get to the whole rising above family origins thing. And we're going to get to it toward the end, but just bear with me, and I promise you everything's going to work itself out. But I'm going to be reading from Numbers chapter 16 in the Bible, and I'm going to read a fairly lengthy passage, but I want to set it up by saying that this was a time of upheaval among the Israelites, where there was a group of people who kind of came against Moses and Aaron, and they were led by a man by the name of Korah, and a couple of other his lieutenants, so to speak, kind of got in his ears. Their name were Dathan and Abiram, and they got in their mind that they were as good as Moses and Aaron, and why should Moses and Aaron set themselves above everybody else in the assembly? That everybody was as holy as they were, and they became insolent. The Bible says they became insolent against the leadership, and it kind of comes down. Things kind of come to a head, and Moses basically calls an assembly for the next day as they rise up against Moses and Aaron. And basically they wanted Moses' authority and they wanted Aaron's priesthood. And they had led about 250 men in opposition against Moses and Aaron. So that's kind of the backdrop of Numbers chapter 16. And Moses, he calls an assembly. And basically, it becomes a showdown between Moses and Aaron, these Korah's group, and these 250 men that he's incited and got them all riled up against the leadership of Israel, and God. And God Moses and Aaron were grieved by these men, but it is clear that God was angry with these men. In fact, the wrath of God shows up pretty strongly in this passage. And I want to pick it up in Numbers chapter 16, verses 19 and following, all the way down to about 34. And just hang in there with me. And then I'm going to shift gears, go back to talking about the earthly fathers, the spiritual fathers, and then we'll get to the text in just a few minutes. Verse 19, it says, when Korah had gathered all his followers in opposition to them at the entrance to the tent of meeting, the glory of the Lord appeared to the entire assembly. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, separate yourselves from this assembly so I can put an end to them at once. And basically he was going to turn all the followers of Korah into, and he was going to get rid of them then and there. In verse 22 it says, but Moses and Aaron fell face down and cried out, O God, God of the spirits of all mankind, will you be angry with the entire assembly when only one man sins? Then the Lord said to Moses, say to the assembly, move away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Moses got up and went to Dathan and Abiram, and the elders of Israel followed him. He warned the assembly, move back from the tents of these wicked men. Do not touch anything belonging to them, or you will be swept away of all their sins, because of all their sins. So they moved away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Now listen to this. It says, Dathan and Abiram had come out and were standing with their wives, children, and little ones at the entrance to their tents. And I want you to notice something. It says Dathan and Abiram and their families stood beside their tents, kind of in defiance against the Lord. But it doesn't say anything about Korah. Korah's family did not stand with him in this moment. And it becomes clear later on in the book of Numbers. Because Korah's, I don't want to bury the lead, but Korah's family, at least his sons, survived this. But it says, so they moved away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Dathan and Abiram had come out and were standing with their wives, children, and little ones at the entrances of their tents. Then Moses said, this is how you will know that the Lord has sent me to do all these things, and it was not my idea. If these men die a natural death and experience only what usually happens to men, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord brings about something totally new, and the earth opens up its mouth and swallows them with everything that belongs to them, and they go down alive into the grave, then you will know that these men have treated the Lord with contempt. And check this out in verse 31. As soon as he finished saying all this, the ground under them split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them with their households and all of Korah's men and all their possessions. They went down alive into the grave with everything they owned. The earth closed over them, and they perished and were gone from the community. And again, that's an uplifting passage for Father's Day. I know it is. But we're going to be looking at, specifically in that passage, we're going to be looking at the sons of Korah who survived. In fact, Numbers 26 picks up on this whole, what happened in Numbers 16. And it says, you remember those people? But it says they were all eliminated. But it says that Korah's sons did not die because they did not stand with their father's wickedness in that moment. And we're going to see toward the end what happens with the sons of Korah, and it's a beautiful thing, I promise you, and it's worth waiting for. But I wanted to start today as, again, the messages of earthly fathers, spiritual fathers, and rising above our family origins. And I want to start out with a little bit about my earthly father. And again, I already said that my relationship with my father was a complicated one, and I don't want to disparage my father in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I learned a lot of lessons from him, and I realized that I took a lot of good from him along the way. And one of the things my dad is he would not take no for an answer, and he had dreams, and if he had some kind of dream or aspiration, he would chase after it with all of his heart. And that's the way I've been in my life, and I'm so grateful for that. And he was a hard worker, and I think I picked up on that along the way. And he was just a man who he rose above his circumstances. And I believe that I've carried on in that tradition as well. But I want to say this, that my dad, he definitely had a heart problem. And actually, he had a heart problem literally and figuratively as well. And I'll explain what I meant. He actually passed away at the age of 63 from a heart attack. It was the third such heart attack in his life. But when I say he had a heart problem, I think he had a broken heart, a wounded heart, if you will. My dad grew up in some very difficult circumstances. His father abandoned his family, walked out on them when he was at a very young age, and it was more than his mom, my dad's mom, could handle. And she began to have mental problems and basically kind of went crazy at some point, and she just couldn't raise the children. And so my father ended up being raised by my aunt and uncle, but not as a son or anything like that, but as a farmhand. And they worked him hard, and they treated him differently from their own sons. And it was clear that he was more a farmhand than someone that was loved. And that caused my dad to really decide that he wanted something different for his life. And he basically pulled himself up by his bootstraps. He put himself through college at Berry College in Rome, Georgia. And then he put himself through a master's program at NC State, paid for it himself, funded it himself, did all the hard work, and went on to a pretty successful career in the agricultural extension world. And, he was a force to be reckoned with. And he loved baseball. And if I remember in our community, if a league was started, my dad probably had something to do with it. There was always Little League, but like the older you got, there wasn't leagues for you. And so if there wasn't a league, my dad would just start it. And he had his boys in mind, and he always wanted us to have the opportunities that he didn't have. And that's the way he just kind of lived his life. But as I said, he did have a wounded heart, a broken heart through life. And there was a point in his life where he decided he wasn't going to have anybody telling him what to do anymore in his life. And that's the way he rolled. And he had just a chip on his shoulder in life. And unfortunately, he took a lot of that out on my mom. And the mental abuse and verbal abuse that she went through was, it was pretty severe. And my dad, he had this forceful way. He would curse her. I hate to say it, he would just curse her up one side and down the other. And it was not good at all. It was just a dysfunctional environment. And this is kind of a little gallows humor, but he would always, he would forcefully say it. And he would always, instead of you, it sounded like he was saying Hugh. And I remember he would be saying Hugh, blankety, 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 blankety to my mom. And one day my brother looked at me and he said, "I don't know who Hugh is, but Dad sure doesn't like him." And again, I have to make light of it. Sometimes you have to laugh about something or you'll cry about it. But my mom did, she just bore the burden of that. She tried to shield us from it. But again, it was a difficult environment. And sometimes all we had in common, my dad and my brother and I, our relationships kind of centered around sports. Again, he loved sports, loved baseball, loved all the sports. And he made sure that we had every opportunity in the world. And he cared about our grades too. He wanted us to make something of ourselves. And so that was important. But again, there was just a lot to overcome. And I'll be honest with you, I resented my dad for a number of years when I was younger. Why did he have to be that way? Why was the environment the way it was in our family? And so I resented him, but the Lord convicted me of that when I was about 14. And I began praying for my dad, and I prayed without any results for God to change my dad's heart from the time I was 14 years old till about 26, and something miraculous happened when I was 26. But I'm so grateful that the Lord put some spiritual fathers into my life, because my dad was far from God. Again, he had that chip on his shoulder. He was sort of mad at the world in a lot of ways. He was still chasing his dreams, but he just always had that chip on his shoulder. And God brought some spiritual leaders into my life. And I'm not going to go deep into the weeds on each one of them, but one of them was, he was my youth and children's pastor. His name was Terrell Watts. And he was just this gregarious guy. He got in there and he played with the kids, and he laughed with us, and we played all these silly games, and he would be chasing us around. He called himself Rattlesnake Man. It was just a game of freeze tag, basically, but he would be chasing us around going, ah. But, he was the first man who ever pulled me aside and shared the gospel with me. He walked me through the plan of salvation, and he was passionate about his relationship with Christ, and he wanted me to have that as well. And I understood it from a intellectual sense, but I just didn't have a heart knowledge of it at the time. But a couple of years later, I would get saved. And but then he ended up being called to preach, and for about 6 months, he was our interim pastor at our church. He kind of shifted positions, and I saw him preach with passion, and it was the first person in my church growing up that had preached with such passion and conviction like that. And it inspired me, and it just made me want more in my life. But then he moved on to be a pastor, and we had a new youth minister and his wife come in, and their name were Mark and Janet Hill. And they were so invaluable in my life. And the one thing that they modeled more than anything, and they modeled a lot, but they modeled what it meant to have a loving Christian household where a husband and wife were committed to one another, who loved one another. Christ was at the center of their relationship. I saw the way they raised their children. I was with them. I would eat dinners with them and just hang out at their house and just kind of watch them. And I just saw them being Jesus to their kids and to each other. And it inspired me. And at 17 years old, I can remember declaring out loud at a youth retreat that we were on that I wanted to be the best husband and father I could possibly be. And that was all. I got to see the example from Mark and Janet, and I will be forever grateful to them for that. And then there was Lewis Perkins, my Sunday school teacher, and he was a guy at one point who was far from God, but God had just radically changed his life, and he was always pushing us to Jesus. He didn't care about religion and all that stuff. He just wanted us to have a relationship with Jesus. And anytime he was teaching on something and the light would come on in somebody's mind and they would finally get what he was talking about, he would just kind of bust out in a woo. And he kind of looked like Bull on Night Court, if you ever saw that character. And but he was a big old bull in a china shop, but he had a teddy bear heart, and he loved the Lord, and he taught me so much, and I'm so grateful for that. And then there was a man by the name of Rick Spees, who, when I first got into ministry, he was one that took me under his wing, and he showed me everything about what it meant to be a minister. Really changed the trajectory of my ministry, changed my life, and I will be forever indebted to him. So I'm so grateful for those spiritual leaders, those spiritual fathers in my life. And but then something interesting happened. About 1996, my father had a massive heart attack and almost died, should have died by all accounts. We spent weeks in the hospital with him, and he overcame that. And about 30 days later, he was going for his 30-day checkup. And he was in the hospital parking lot. A guy who had also had heart issues was driving him there. And he saw my dad sweating and just kind of he knew something was wrong. And he immediately, instead of taking him to where his doctor's appointment was, he took him to the emergency room. And my dad was having a blood clot in his heart. And he literally, and a blood clot in your heart is instant death. Almost, 999 out of 1,000 times, it would be instant death. And my dad coded on the table a couple of times, but they were able to bring him back to life and resuscitate him. And he made a full recovery. And they called him the medical miracle of the year at Pinehurst Hospital. I'll never forget that. And we spent another month in the hospital. And there were times where, some days where he'd be talking out of his head because he just didn't have enough oxygen. But I remember one day in particular, he had been kind of out of his head when my mom and my brother had been there. But that night, he was fully coherent, and I was spending time with him. And it was one of the few serious conversations that we ever had that didn't have to do with sports or school. And it was the first night that I realized that my dad had, in this process, and when all this stuff had been going on with his heart, when he had been facing death, at some point my dad invited Christ into his life. And I remember him saying, I know that I have Jesus in my heart. And I can't tell you what it means to me to know that. And my dad went on to live 6 more years after that. And I really saw a change in him. And God just gave us a gift, and seeing that transformation in my dad. And I can remember my mom, she'd always been the one that had made sure that church was a priority in our life. And she was the one that was just making sure. She would always say, you're not going to be like your father. And she would drag us to church, every service that she could possibly get us to. And I remember a few times where she wasn't feeling good, and she wouldn't go to church. And my dad, who had never gone to church in all my years, would just go on to church by himself because he wanted to be there and he wanted to be a part of it. And it was just miraculous to see the change in my life. And I said this title of this message was of earthly fathers and spiritual fathers and rising above family origins. And my dad did that. He did it just by being a success in his life in general, as far as his career path and realizing some of his dreams and getting his college degree and getting his master's degree and all those things. But when he accepted Christ, it literally changed his family origin. And I had already committed, as I said, that I was going to change my family tree. And I knew that I was going to raise my kids to love the Lord. And I remember it was declaring that, this is going to be a house where, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And I'm so grateful that I married a believing wife who had that same ambition and wanted that same thing in her life. And we set out to build a new history in our families, and just to see all of our kids come to Christ, to see all of them chase their dreams and become what Christ would have them to be. And it's so important, and that's what we see in this in the passage I read. And the reason I read the passage in Numbers chapter 16 is that I want us to look at the sons of Korah. And again, their father had come against Moses and the leadership that God had put in place. And unlike Dathan's family and unlike Abiram's family, his sons did not stand with him. They knew that their father was in the wrong. And they withdrew their support. And they were nowhere near that tent when God allowed that whole area to be swallowed up. And all those men, all those 250 men who had come against Moses and Aaron were killed. And I know that they had to do, I know it took tremendous fortitude for them to go against their father in that moment, to go with God and to go with the leadership of Moses and Aaron over their own fleshly father. But they knew what he was standing for wasn't right, and they didn't want any part of it. And because of that, God spared them. And you say, what is the significance of the sons of Korah? Well, we learn it later on. If you've ever read the Psalms, perhaps you've read a heading sometime where it says written by, like for Psalm 46, for instance, it says, for the director of music of the sons of Korah, a song. You see, the sons of Korah ended up writing 11 psalms in the Bible. These were things that they would worship to during those times. They would sing. We read them as like literature, but they would sing them as songs. And God used them in a mighty and a powerful way. He had destroyed their families. He had destroyed all these other men, but he spared the sons of Korah, and he allowed them. He used them in such a way they were included in God's holy word. And I want us just to look at a couple of them, a couple of passages today. Psalm 46 verses 1 through 3, and this is a passage that you've heard before, but it hits different when you know the sons of Korah's background. Listen to this in Psalm 46 verses 1 through 3. It says, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though the waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. And literally, they had seen that firsthand in their lives when their father was swallowed up by the earth. When God was so furious with him for him coming against Moses and coming against Aaron and by default coming against God himself. They had seen these men swallowed up. But in this passage, they say, God, these sons of Korah, they say, God is our refuge, even though the earth be removed from us. It really hits different when you think about it that way. And then there's one more familiar passage. Again, they wrote 11 of these Psalms. And I would encourage you to look them up and read them yourself. But this is another one that's very familiar. Psalm 84, verse 10, and it says this. And it's a song that's very popular in our day as the basis for this passage. But listen to it very carefully. It says, better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked. For the Lord God is a sun and a shield. Did you catch that last part? I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked. And they had made that decision through tears long ago when they had to choose whether they would stand with their father or stand against him. And through tears in their eyes, I'm sure they had to choose to stand against him. They would rather dwell in the presence of the Lord than dwell in the tents of the wicked. And because of that, their life was saved. And a legacy was created that would have never been created had they not risen above their family origins. And I want to tell you today, nothing is impossible with God. I want to tell you that I don't know what your background is. I don't know what your story is, but you can rise above if you will just put your hope and trust in God. If you will allow him to be your refuge. If you will allow him to be your shield. If you will allow him to be your strength. And Lord, if you'll allow the Lord to just begin to work in you and say, Lord, I just want to create a legacy of people who are followers of Christ. I want my children and their children and their children to follow you, Lord. Help me to lead them in the right way. I promise you He will change the trajectory of your family tree. He will change your family origin. He will start with you if you will allow him, if you will submit yourselves to him, if you'll surrender to him, if you'll place your faith and trust in him. God will change your origins. God will change your family tree. I saw him do it with my father. It took a while. And I saw him do it in my life. And I'm seeing it in my children's life. And I pray that God will allow me to see it in my grandchildren's lives as they grow up. And so forth and so on. You can create a different legacy if it starts today. And Lord, as we wrap up this message, I pray today that for someone under the sound of my voice, maybe they have a similar story to me. I pray that you will touch their hearts today. I pray that they will see their need for you. Lord, that they will place their faith and their trust in you. They will allow you to shape their hearts and shape their story and shape their history and shape their family tree. Lord, you will set them in a new direction, and their children will be set in a new direction, and their children's children will be set in a new direction. Lord, so much is at stake today. Our lives, our legacy, our hope, our future. And I pray that someone under the sound of my voice will be determined today that they will place their hope and their trust in you and allow you to transform their entire history, their entire family history. And it starts with one decision. And I pray that they'll make that decision today. Thank you so much for being with us, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks again for listening.